Dana Denha here, and this is Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Every year, talented filmmakers from all over the world aim to take part in our local film fest. Sometimes the talent isn't far from home as locals make their mark on this internationally renowned annual event. Joining me is Scott Northrup, a skilled filmmaker that takes you into the depths of his own memories, real or imagined, with his film, Echoes in a Shallow Bay. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'd like to know first, why don't you talk about what led you to filmmaking? Because we were talking a little bit before the show, and you were more of just a fine art artist.
Yeah, collage, actually, is the way I got into filmmaking. It just made sense because it was cutting and pasting. And when I started making films, I was working primarily with Super 8, a little bit of 16 millimeter. So I was actually using analog film at the time. And I don't know, as a kid, I always made collages, and I was working at that time primarily doing printmaking and sculpture, and began working with found objects and ideas, which then led into filmmaking for me.
You know what's interesting is when I went to Wayne State, and when I started school, I was actually a fine art major, and I did get my degree in fine art with an emphasis in photography, but I kind of started going more towards the path of like media arts, and so it's kind of, it's a similar sort of.
For sure. So my undergrad degree was BFA focusing in sculpture, and then a few years after that I decided to go back and get my master's, and I focused on media studies with an emphasis on film production and audio.
So where did you go to school, and then that kind of led you to where you are today too, where you went to school?
Yeah, I actually went to Wayne State for 2 years, and I studied sculpture and printmaking there primarily, and then when I transferred to College for Creative Studies, which just a few blocks away, that's where I took a film and a video class the same semester, and there was no, I think I mentioned this already, but there was no further steps after that. So my instructors all let me experiment within their classes. So in my drawing class, I did a film for my final, because I convinced my instructor that that was painting with light, and she was cool with it. So I always had people that were open to me trying different things and incorporating performance and film with everything else I was doing. And then for my master's, I went to the New School in New York and focused on media studies.
So that was, you were in school in the late 80s. So what were your film options back then anyways? Like what materials could you even really be using? Were people digitally doing much of anything?
So yeah, I took those courses in '89, the fall of '89, and then really focused more on like rephotographing objects and some performance I was doing. Kind of playing with narrative, but I don't think I only made maybe 1 or 2 straight narratives, and they're still fairly experimental. It's just been my approach and what I'm drawn to more. Even the film we're going to talk about later today, I think, in my mind, is narrative, but it's much more abstract than that and minimal. So yeah, it was a lot of performance-based work at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what leads you to the path of the Ann Arbor Film Festival, is like that whole experimental thing. But I think that not always, but there's definitely like, you can see a narrative in films when you're watching these experimental ones. It's just not an obvious one.
No, and often I think people who are unfamiliar with experimental work don't know where to place themselves within the film and navigate that in a way. And I think sometimes if you take the approach that you're the protagonist and you're experiencing this, it's a way to understand it in a different way, I guess in a base way.
So you're teaching now, but you teach a lot more than just film.
Yeah, so I teach filmmaking courses, primarily experimental and documentary, but also narrative work. And I also work with game and animation students on concept design and character development. And then I work with photography, fine art, and ad students, and sometimes crafts, actually. I've been working with one of our crafts instructors, Kim Hardy. We've been making lenses for my students to shoot with, and then we also create installation pieces together.
And you actually just got back from Finland. Why don't you tell us what you had going on there?
Yeah, so I did a 5-week residency in Hamankiero. And there I made a couple of films, one that is primarily text. It was a text residency. So I made a film that's meant to be projected onto the Finnish landscape at dusk, which sounds kind of esoteric, but which is kind of a love letter from me to the region, and it works as a monologue as you're watching it. And then I made another short looping piece. It was text, but became very graphic. And I wrote a series of short stories and poetry, and I made a couple of zines and started a screenplay and some collage work. So it was a really great experience with 10 other artists from around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Just really good exchange with them.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was great. Came back really relaxed.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about your experience with the Ann Arbor Film Festival, because you've had a few films in it, an installation piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, think the first time I was involved with festivals when I first moved back to the area, because I lived in New York for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked, I think in 2007 with them as a screener for the experimental category. And I was invited by the director at the time, Kristen Leon.
Mm-hmm.
And so she asked me to be a part of that. And then for several years, I screened experimental and animation work for the festival and got a lot of my students involved in volunteer work or just getting them to the festival to see more work. And I think anytime you can experience it in the proper setting is the best way to see it, not just in class,
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm sure you can relate to. And then, yeah, my first film showed there in 2010, a short called Everything to Live For.
Uh-huh.
And then I did a 9-piece installation, 9-channel video installation for the 50th anniversary called If I Could Walk Forever If There's Nowhere for Me to Sit.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to meet George that year, George Manapelli, who founded the festival.
Uh-huh.
That was a wonderful experience. And then this film played a few years later. And now I'm on the education committee. I've been on that for a few years. We organize workshops and panel discussions throughout the festival. And that schedule will be online shortly, I believe, for this year.
Okay, well, we're going to take a look at one of your pieces from the festival. Now that we've heard about Scott's career and experience with the Ann Arbor Film Festival, let's watch his film, Echoes in a Shallow Bay. Well, thanks, Scott, for sharing your work with us.
Yeah.
Why don't you explain a little bit the concept behind the film?
Okay. I think I might have mentioned that I collected this material over several years. And I would look at the film that I'd collected, because they were from different sources, and I started pulling, and it was just an organic process to make this. It wasn't that I set out with the concept of making this abstract horror type film. And I realized I was drawn to all these shots that were shot from the water, looking back at the landscape. And then I started reducing, taking out anything that had people in it. And it became more of a ghost town in a way, or a ghost world. So yeah, it started very organically, and it took quite a while to actually make the piece, as I just kept whittling it away to what I felt needed to be there.
When you say you found it, where do you go to find something like this?
Friends have given me things that they found at estate sales. I've found things in the trash.
Yeah.
I found one reel in the bottom of a box of film equipment I bought for $20. I bought 2 boxes for $20 at an estate sale. And in the bottom, I got to my car and I thought, I'll take out all the trash and just dump it.
Yeah.
And I found this canister in one of those boxes. I went back in to give it to the family because it had a shot list that their grandfather or uncle, somebody had made. And they're like, you take it, we'll never watch it, do something with it. So I held on to that one for a while, and that part of that is in this film as well.
Wow, that's really interesting, because when you watch the film, I mean, everything seems to really flow together well, but like you said, it took you a while to get the piece actually together, so I think you were very conscious of that while you were making it.
For sure, and the color grading that's done on it and the textures, it's like some of those are color sources, some were black and white, and it was a matter of bringing them into a similar world. There is one section that has kind of a blue tint to it when it's out on the water, and you can see some rock formations. And that was also a very conscious decision.
Yeah. Well, and then there's like those parts where you like kind of lose the film, which also has like that ghostly kind of effect, like it kind of freak you out a little bit while you're watching it.
Oh, good. Yeah, the piece was actually made silent for an installation I did at the Namdi Center for Contemporary Art in Detroit. And there was an exhibition curated by Michael Stone Richards, who the show was about immateriality and immateriality. And I wanted something that would disappear. And I'd spoken with George Namdi, who owns the space, and there was a skylight on this wall, and I thought if I could project it here. So he gave me this 8 by 16 foot wall to work with. So I consciously made it disappear. In the skylight, it would completely disappear. So there was just the wall there. And then the sound that we hear now, there's a bass track that comes from the picture of itself. So I fed the picture back in as an audio loop. And that's why it's subtle, but the frequency changes with the frequency changes with the different values. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the sound, it definitely gives you that creep factor, too, while you're watching it. And it's like, because I watched you gave me 2 film spears to watch. And the other one's very much has like a narrative that goes through it, and it's like that 1950s sort of like, almost like a happy-go-lucky sort of thing. But when you're listening to it, it's also like this sadness. But this one, you watch it and you're like, whoa. I mean, it's just like it's this whole experience for your eyes and your ears while you're watching it.
Good. I'm very conscious of that, obviously, while crafting it. But you can never know if that's actually going to translate to someone else, you know? Which is thing working with students, always trying to get them to understand, like, you've got to get outside your own head sometimes to make sure it's communicating. It's funny what you're saying about the other film, though, Everything to Live For, like the happy-go-luckiness. I guess there is a wistfulness in the imagery.
There totally is, yes.
But then the voiceover, is darker and sadder. It's a film about loss. And there's a lot of unanswered questions in it, purposely. So, but a lot of the text from that is actually taken from a romance novel.
Really?
That I appropriated and then rewrote from memory to create this flow of this dialogue,
Because the 2 films to me were so different, and it was hard for me to decide, too, because I really liked both of them. But I was like kind of, because I feel like I haven't really talked to anyone about doing more of like a horror sort of film from the film festival.
Sure.
And what kind of led you down that path? Because I'm wondering if you've done other horror style stuff.
No, I haven't. It was more at that time, after I made the first one that you saw, Everything to Live For, I started thinking about genre more. And I think part of that also, I'm teaching, and I'm teaching different ways to tell a story. So I was kind of experimenting with that and just seeing where that would lead. And that film just kind of took shape in this horror space, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was in the festival in what, 2011 then?
I made it in 2011, and I think it was in the festival 2012 or 13. Yeah,
Okay, so was that, did you have to submit that digitally then when you submitted that?
That was submitted digitally, yes.
Okay. But the one thing, I was looking at your website, and you talk about the themes that you have in your work, like romance, loss, longing, secret feelings. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that and what attracts you to that, those sort of feelings?
Well, I think there's always a charge with that kind of stuff, because there are things we don't say to each other, or we're afraid to say to each other. So I try to make those feelings manifest in some way. I try to make objects that can speak those things for you.
Yeah.
Recently, I did a piece this fall. It's just called The Letter, but it's an edited version of a letter that my grandmother's best friend wrote to her before they died. They both died the same year. And it's devastating, but it's only 3 sentences. And I don't know, that to me is just, it's so profound in a way. It's something that you never would normally say to someone unless you were pushed. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
So it's almost like that uncomfortableness that of being just like a human being that you kind of reach for.
Yeah, that's something. Okay, so you asked about horror, and something with like good science fiction, which I like good science fiction, and I say good purposely because I think there's always a human element that draws us into it that we can connect with, and we care about these people or this alien or whatever that is.
Yes, agreed.
So I try to achieve that with even the objects I'm making or installations I'm making. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But do you feel like these themes are always recurring in your work, or do you kind of like spray off into other areas as well?
I think they're there, whether I like them or not.
Yeah, it's just something that's always kind of like in the back
It's
of your
organic,
mind.
yeah. For a long time, especially when I was in my 20s, I thought the work was often about dealing with religion or dealing with that, something in that vein. And then I started to realize a few years ago, around the time I made Everything to Live For, that there was this thread of romance and unrequited love through a lot of the work. And then I thought, well, why not just exploit that further? Why is that something we shouldn't talk about? We should be talking about that. It's a human emotion.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's important.
Do you feel the romance is present in Echoes in a Shallow Bay? I find it in the imagery.
I do
think
too.
there's like some romance in the imagery
For sure.
of it.
Especially the very last shot. You know, that there's a very faint boat off in the distance.
Yes.
And a friend of mine finds that to be the most chilling shot in the whole film, the creepiest. And she thinks that that has everything in it that the film is saying, where there's potential for something to happen, the danger. And I think there's romance in that for sure, yeah.
How do you find that your work as a fine artist has taken part in your filmmaking and other aspects? Because I feel like you're just so tied to all the arts in a way, talking to you.
Yeah, I always look at it as languages in a way. So I don't always approach like I'm going to make a film or I'm going to do a sculpture or a performance or whatever it is. It's more that, you know, sometimes things just form in my studio as I'm working and I start playing with something or cutting something up and this collage forms or whatever. Other times it's more an idea that I start working out and I realize, well, I need to say it through cross stitch or I need to say it as a film, and it just starts to take shape in that way. So I feel kind of fortunate that I have all these different skill sets that function as languages and ways to say something visually. Yeah, I don't know. I feel really fortunate in that way.
No, I think you are. I think I agree. I think there's something to be said about being able to have that outlet and to be able to have it in so many different facets of the art world too.
Thanks. When I first moved back to the area, you know, about 10 years ago, or a little more over that, a curator for an exhibition I was in was surprised by what I brought to that show. It wasn't what he had seen in my studio. And he said, you know, you're different every time I see you. I don't know what to make of you. But I think it all makes sense when you start piecing it together. And there are definite threads that can be pulled throughout the work.
So we're just about out of time, but if you could tell people, you know, maybe why they should get involved in some way or another with the Ann Arbor Film Festival as a filmmaker or maybe just as a viewer or a volunteer.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of opportunities every year with the film festival. The screening process is done at this point, but that starts in the fall, and a lot of local filmmakers and people around the country actually participate in that. I think going as a viewer is just a wonderful experience. Not as a filmmaker, there's always the pressure worrying about like
How
is
the
sound,
audience
yeah,
gonna react
how's the audience gonna react? What's the sound like? How's the picture going to look? But as a viewer, I think it can be just a wild experience, and just go to a screening. Don't worry about what's showing. Just kind of dive in, and because there's some really wonderfully curated programs, and there's even a music video program. There's a children's program on the weekends, on Saturday that week. I don't know, I think just diving in and experiencing it. The panel discussions and roundtable talks we'll be doing this year also are really promising. One in particular, I think a student or two of mine will be participating in, is for young female filmmakers that focus also on game. So it brings in the interaction from that, and also just telling narrative stories that feel more like game or inspired by game. Yeah, there's, I don't know, a lot of opportunities for sure.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
To watch this and other CTN series online, visit a2gov.org/CTN. Until next time, I'm Dana Denho.